Let me tell you something of a story. I understand this story to be historically true, but I can't point you to a single history book that will give you the truth of it. You have to instead trust that the spirit of it is, as far as I know, true, and if I wind up being historically wrong, that doesn't mean that my point is necessarily incorrect. But rather, the nature of the story makes it a bit challenging to search for using my conventional means. After World War II, Japan went through a period of modernization that involved, amongst other things, the adoption of a constitution, which was largely seen as a major shift away from a previous imperial vision of Japan. Part of this shift involved the inclusion of a right of religious freedom. Now, it might not surprise you to know that America was very much involved in the creation of the Japanese Constitution, as it was involved with a lot of things just after World War II in Japan, for reasons. This stipulation of freedom of religion was seen by Americans as very important, and when presented to the Japanese government as to its significance, this became a confusing point of contention. Because if you look at Japanese practice of religion, right now, according to the statistics, Japan has over 180 million different people registered with a religion. There are only 120 million people in Japan. This discrepancy is because most people who practice some faith, as you might understand that term, are practicing multiple forms of it. Shintoism and Buddhism are both what, in the West, we would describe as being faiths. But also, in the West, it's very common to see a faith as being exclusionary. There are not many people who consider themselves to be Catholic Protestants. It is a grouping into which you are isolated. Meanwhile, in Japan, the argument about religious freedom, especially as it related to Christian missionaries, was seen as a non-factor, because Christians who did not want to participate in Shinto or Buddhism were, by many practitioners of Shinto and Buddhism, seen as not being coerced into doing anything quote-unquote religious. Those are just cultural practices that everyone does. This story has a lot of different dimensions and a lot of ways it shakes out. I don't want to say that I'm on one side or the other, because I'm not on any of these sports teams, but I definitely got brought up in one of them. But this conversation reminds me, whenever I think too much about what it's like to look at other cultures, about how sometimes there are things, categorical things, definitional things, that might just be completely untrue, and you don't know what you don't know. I bring this up because I want to talk to you about a game that I'm not even sure I can pronounce correctly. Balikbayan. Balikbayan is made by Jamila Nejahi of Sword Queen Games. I'm very sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I'm not trying to be disrespectful here. The game runs on the Belonging Outside Belonging system, which is itself powered by the Apocalypse system. In this case, the system is building on an existing structure for a GM-less game that can then have a GM interpose into it and add depth and concepts to the work. What the game has going for it is a lot of style and verve. If I wanted to, if I was more confidently an idiot, I would be happy to talk to you about what Balikbayan's about, how it feels, what it's meant to inspire in you. I could pitch it, and I could tell you, using all sorts of cultural signifiers and ideas and explanations for what things are and what they're like, that would ultimately be coming from my context. As I understand it, one of the major cultural influences in Balikbayan is the Filipino culture. And weirdly, I have a relationship to the Filipino culture. I say weirdly because it's a relationship that should never be held up as an example of me knowing about them. I have family members who've lived in the Philippines for years. I have family members who speak some Filipino language. I couldn't tell you which ones, I couldn't tell you how well. And I have family members and close friends growing up where their time spent in the Philippines was a very important part of why we revered them as members of our social circle. Because to me, growing up, the Philippines was a place where missionaries went. I have stories from relatives about the time spent in the Philippines doing missionary work and building sheds and eating plantains and rice, and how complicated and interesting the place is and how different stories they have of bringing people to Christ across the stories of all the different things they did for the people there. I think this is why I tread so carefully when talking about Balikbayan. As a system, it's robust. Like, this is a Powered by the Apocalypse game system. It uses a very good set of mechanics, especially including the idea that you can turn a failure into a currency to spend later. You can, when the story doesn't go the way you want it to, set up that story beat and tuck it away and say, all right, this can come back and bite me later. And in a GM-less game, other people can choose how to relate to you choosing to do that. Or the GM can take that and like, all right, well, we'll sort that out later. Which means that you get to make these choices about big, dramatic success and failure, but you don't necessarily get to know when and how they impact you. If you know anything about the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which I've talked about before, you probably will look at this game as an unremarkable beast. When you strip away that mechanical surface, which I'm not expert enough to really dig into, what you're left then with is the style of Balikbayan. What is the setting of Balikbayan about? What is it trying to do? What does it want to evoke? And as best I can see, this is a mythic cyberpunk narrative situated in a part of Asia that my cultural background has tried to make invisible to me my entire life. And that makes me a little uncomfortable and awkward about telling you what Balikbayan is. I can direct your attention towards it. I can point you in the space that Balikbayan is. I can ask you to go look at it, and I can ask you to look into the kinds of things it's trying to do. But more than that, what I really want is for more people to see Balikbayan, and for people for whom this does represent something of a sincere experience or a relationship to something that they don't feel this colonizer feeling about, and be able to say, hey, this is dope. I love this. I'd love for this game to get finished. Because that's one of the things about Balikbayan. It's an unfinished project. You can play it. It works. But the work describes itself as not complete. And there's definitely more the game could do. The game offers you future versions if you've purchased it. And it's interesting, and it's full of all these signifiers and notes and a vision of the mythic and elemental that I could try and describe. But in my trying and describing it, I would always know that I was building someone else's ideas with bricks from my own home. And I feel that that's a disrespect that could be done to something that seems so fiercely and so urgently to be demanding to be taken on its own grounding. This is obviously a little challenging to talk about. At this point, I've almost told you nothing about Balikbayan beyond, hey, go check this out. It makes me, a really white guy, uncomfortable, but I'm using that as a selling point. The thing that made me stop short on a typical examination of Balikbayan was to dig through the character play sheets and to look at them and realize what I was doing and how I was doing it. The playbooks in this game are named appropriate to the setting. So there is the Tikbalang, the Diwata, the Saint, the Aswang, the Santelmo, and the Duende. And I don't know how close I'm getting those words to right. I feel quite awkward saying them, and I know that there's a trick I learned growing up, which was say the name confidently and smoothly, and everyone will go, oh, that's how it's pronounced. But even then, that's me imposing parts of my life on this. And I thought, well, first I will describe the Santelmo, when it's about ghosts that are related to death. So that's the psychopomp. That's kind of your classic Greek myth. It's your ferryman. And I realized that that's not what this is. A Santelmo is not a Greek myth processed through a European-based British-Australian boy. It's a Santelmo. It's a thing for its own space, of its own space. And if I were to try and describe it to you, I would be doing so with these inadequate tools. Even the term saint, I look at it and I wonder, hey, is that meaning that the way that I'm used to that being meant? And I think this is why I want to recommend you look at Balikbayan. Because Balikbayan is extremely fiercely itself. And I don't want to try and tell you what Balikbayan is. I want to tell you to go look at Balikbayan and trust it to tell you what it is.